Cedar Point in Sandusky, Ohio, is the second oldest amusement park in North America. It's home to 68 rides, a mile-long beach, and 18 world-class roller coasters. Steaming below these massive rides is the Cedar Point and Lake Erie Railroad. For over 60 years, the 15-minute ride has remained a favorite of all ages and hauls on average over 1 million riders per year over approximately 1.3 miles of track. The CP&LE holds a wealth of history and distinguishes itself as one of the few amusement parks in the country that operates coal-fired narrow-gauge steam locomotives. So come along for the ride as we take an in-depth look into the railroad's history and operation. The amusement park's humble origins can be traced back to 1870 when Sandusky businessman Louis Zistel opened a small beer garden, bathhouse, and dance floor on the peninsula. He would bring guests over to Cedar Point on his steamboat, Young Reindeer, for the modest price of 25 cents. In 1888, Cedar Point's 5 landowners formed a co-partnership to operate the peninsula as a resort. They would build the Grand Pavilion, which featured an auditorium, bowling alleys, and dining facilities. In 1897, several directors of the Lake Erie and Western Railroad decided to buy the land and form the Cedar Point Pleasure Resort Company. They also appointed Indiana entrepreneur George A. Beckling as general manager to run the park.
1897, George Beckling comes into the picture. He's from Indiana, saw a really untapped opportunity. And so he arranged financing and bought his way in, took over the operation of the place, and really turned it around. Took it from a weekend-only local resort that nobody knew about outside of, I would say, a 300-mile radius. People were coming up to Cedar Point from like Columbus by train, but nothing any farther than that. And so George Beckling, when he came in 1897, really turned that around.
Upon his death in 1931, Cedar Point's expansion halted for the next 20 years. The park's state worsened in the 1950s, leading to financial difficulties. In 1956, George A. Roos and Emile LaGrosse took control of Cedar Point and proposed building a residential development on the peninsula, but their plans weren't received with open arms.
Roos and LaGrosse were basically businessmen. One was from Toledo, one was from Cleveland. They had worked together on a lot of different projects already, but they were basically not amusement park people. They saw the opportunity for the peninsula, and they basically did a semi-hostile takeover of the place. One of the game plans was to do a residential area, but it was not instead of what was already going on. They were actually looking at the frontier town area, which was totally undeveloped at the time. The only thing that was back there was marshland. The lagoons had been dug. There were some cottages back there around the lighthouse area, but that was a very untapped area. The game plan was to keep hotel breakers and that amusement park circle as long as it stayed profitable. And they were only going to shut down the amusement park if it became unprofitable, but they were going to try to turn that part around. The problem is, well, there were a couple problems with it. First of all the concessionaires for the games and the food and all that, all those contracts had 2 more years on their contract. So if they wanted to, they could not touch those without breaking contract, and the loss on that monetarily would have been not worth it. So those basically had to stay as is for a couple years. 3,000 houses in the Sandusky area is a huge amount of houses. Population of Sandusky at the time, even right now, is probably 25 to 30,000 people. It's not a huge area. Putting 3,000 ranch houses on the market is not doable. And at that point in time, Sandusky had a real estate glut going on. You couldn't sell a house in Sandusky for fair value, and now you're going to dump 3,000 more houses there. So the city of Sandusky was against this. Ohio statewide did not like it either. They were afraid of the repercussions with the state access to the public beach. They really didn't like the idea that possibly Hotel Breakers was going to come down. They really didn't want this happening. So there was more legislation again going in saying, let's take this over and make this a state park. A couple things happened in the time period to get Roos and LaGrosse to change their mind. The amusement park part of it started breaking even, which was huge. Disneyland in California opened and started making big money. So they basically had a change of mind and decided to put the residential idea on hold. They didn't cancel it for a while, but it was on hold. And they started developing the amusement park area.
One of those new attractions added by the men in 1960 was a 16-inch railway pulled by a gasoline-powered locomotive designed to resemble an 1865 steam engine. The route of this ride started near the antique cars, then crossed a small bridge and continued to the western cruise docks. Now, this wasn't the park's first train ride. In fact, Cedar Point in the past has had as many as 4, with the earliest being a 15-inch live steam railway in 1907. However, this new miniature railway clearly wasn't enough for George Roos as he began to devise a plan for a much larger and authentic railroad. As legend has it, while Roos was visiting Disneyland, the park's 36-inch narrow-gauge railroad captivated him. He saw the little 1894-built 244T engine named Fred Gurley pulling a consist of 5 open-air type passenger cars. This former plantation locomotive gave him the idea of buying his own to run on a railroad at Cedar Point.
Bruce was a fan of railroads in the first place. He had a train in his backyard, that type of thing. He lived in Portland and he actually had a train engine in his backyard during the 60s. Not really quite sure if he kind of copied the idea from Disney. There were some other amusement park venues that had trains going on with that. The exact details I'm not up on. But we're not sure exactly where he got the idea to do this at Cedar Point.
Shortly after Roos's encounter with the Disneyland Railroad, he began scouring the country for narrow-gauge steam engines. Eventually, he made an acquaintance with Arthur LaSalle of the American Railroad Equipment Association, who specialized in saving and restoring steam locomotives. He sold Roos an 044T named Model, built in 1902 by the Baldwin Locomotive Works in Philadelphia. The oil-burning locomotive spent all its life hauling sugarcane on the Laurel Valley Plantation in Louisiana. The plantation owner named it after his 2-year-old daughter, Maud Lapina. When Maud arrived at Sandusky in December 1961, work on restoring the dilapidated engine started immediately under the guidance of LaSalle and his partner, Clyde Barber. They started by disassembling the engine down to every last nut and bolt. Afterwards, they sent its boiler down to Toledo for copying, and the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad's Willard shop turned its 4 driving wheels. Cosmetic work included adding a wooden cow catcher, box headlamp, and $1,400 worth of brass and gold leaf trim. After the new boiler was installed, the engine received a fresh coat of green and red paint, and Barber hand-painted artwork on the sides of his sand dome and headlamp. Lastly, a pony truck was added, making the engine into a 244T. As Maud's restoration was ongoing, George Roos presented his idea to the park's board to build an authentic railroad as an attraction. However, they shot down his proposal, but ironically, there were others within the corporation quietly mapping out their own railroad. They even went as far as leasing an 040T narrow-gauge locomotive from the Louisiana Patu Plantation in March 1962. Once again, Roos pitched his plan, but this time to construct the railroad on his own and lease the right-of-way from Cedar Point. Like last time, they rejected his new proposition. Growing frustrated, Roos began considering taking Model elsewhere. However, by the summer of 1962, things had changed. The board gave him the green light on building the private railway. The 1.6-mile Cedar Point and Lake Erie Railroad was a cost $500,000 to build, employing Model and 6 passenger coaches. Solon's Acme Construction Company was awarded contracts to lay the tracks, while Port Clinton's Lakecraft Welding Company was tasked with fabricating the passenger cars and handling Maud's mechanical work. Roos also picked up a running mate for Maud in August 1962 that was to be refurbished alongside it. The 1922 Vulcan Ironworks 040T originally worked at a coal mine in Clay Bank, Ohio. When the engine arrived at the Port Clinton shop, its saddle tank, steel cab, stack, and boiler jacket were all removed. It received a new wooden cab, tender, and fancy cosmetic work like applied on Maud. The route of the railroad was to start off the Funway just west of the Western Cruise Dock, where it would run north past the Cedars Hotel and then along the Sandusky Bayshore. Once near the old Coast Guard station, the line would run back south through an undeveloped cedar grove laced with lagoons made in 1904. Finally, work on the line began in February 1963, with bulldozers first clearing the right-of-way of trees and grading the land. The next month, section gangs were busy laying the track, while large cranes placed the pilings for the 3 lagoon trestles. At Lakecraft Welding, the finishing touches were being applied to Model as the passenger cars were taking shape. These were modeled after Disneyland's Narragansett cars, pulled by Fred Gurley and placed on retired Denver and Rio Grande flat car trucks. As the equipment slowly started showing up at the point, crews were racing to finish construction of a station on the Funway. In the midst of this, Lakecraft informed George that the number 22 would not be ready to operate by opening day with Maud. So, he decided to lease an engine that was ready to run from LaSalle. The 1911 Davenport-built 260 named Albert had been previously on lease to the short-lived Cherokee Wonderland Amusement Park in North Carolina. LaSalle acquired the handsome locomotive from a junkyard in Louisiana, and just like Maud, Albert spent his career hauling sugarcane at the St. John Plantation. The engine was named after the plantation's owner's 19-year-old son, Albert Levert, who was in charge of the railroad. By request of Cherokee Wonderland, LaSalle refurbished and backdated Albert to appear as a Civil War-era locomotive. In mid-May 1963, preparations for the CP&LE's opening were nearly complete. The construction of the line was finished, and the station only needed a few more weeks to become fully operational. The 2 locomotives awaited service, securely housed in the new engine shed. On May 25th, the park invited representatives from Sandusky's local railroads and press members to a special ceremony to launch the CP&LE. Model and Albert got into position for a spike driving ceremony, inspired by the completion of the 1869 Transcontinental Railroad. Unfortunately, the line's opening was off to a slippery start. As Maud was backing away from Albert on the station siding, his pilot truck derailed. Railroad crews had to re-rail the locomotive by attaching a chain to Albert and towed Maud back to the shop. Afterwards, Albert returned to pull the officials on the inaugural run, but couldn't get the train moving on the slippery rails. Eventually, after applying sand for traction, the determined engine successfully got its consist rolling. But these operational gripes only continued, and on a second day of public operations on May 26, a loaded train derailed at the crossover switch near the engine house. Thankfully, there were no injuries, and the park's maintenance staff quickly re-railed the car, enabling normal operations to resume. Though the biggest mishap happened halfway through Cedar Point's 4-month season, when Albert's ash pan set the first trestle on fire, causing enough damage for it to be repaired. Nonetheless, the CP&LE was an instant success with park guests. A ride in the train cost 50 cents for adults and 25 cents for children. As a way to generate more ridership, since the railroad was a concession, Roos authorized the building of an animated ghost town. Special Effects Incorporated of Morrison, Colorado, created animated skeletons and buzzards, while Cedar Point crews constructed a rundown village complete with a schoolhouse, blacksmith shop, tonsorial parlor, jail, saloon, and a Wells Fargo station. Whenever a train would pass through the town, a duel would ensue between the sheriff and a cowboy, each firing their revolvers. Among the other promotional stunts employed during the season included the appearance of Pat Kelly, son of the famous hobo clown Emmett Kelly. Pat would attempt to bum rides on the train until the conductor finally threw him off. During the 1964 season expansion, $55,000 was spent on improving the ghost town by adding additional animatronics like an elopement scene, a music hall with a skeleton orchestra, and a burning Wells Fargo stage station. This effect worked by using specially treated wood that could withstand the gasoline and propane flames for 30 seconds, giving the illusion the building was ablaze. Across from the tracks not far from this building stood a barn constructed for live actors portraying bandits to conceal themselves until a train appeared. Once the train passed, they were expected to emerge, fire their weapons, and then the sheriff aboard the train would return fire. To bolster the anticipation of increased ridership, 2 enclosed-style passenger coaches were fabricated by Lakecraft. Roos also acquired 2 wooden standard-gauge cabooses originally built for the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad that were reconditioned and put on narrow-gauge trucks. In spite of all these added additions, the sudden breakdowns, loss of steam, and disorganization the CP&LE experienced in his first season was concerning for Roos. He determined that the railroad was doomed unless they could find expert management for the line. After traveling throughout the eastern and southern part of the United States, George found his man in Knoxville, Tennessee, Jack Foster.
When George was down there, George Roos was down there scouting around and looking for engines, he came across Jack Foster, who was an old Southern Railroad guy. And he was, Jack started out, as I understand it, when he was about 14 years old with one of the logging railroads. And then he eventually hired on with the Southern and was road foreman of engines, and he was shop foreman in one of the big roundhouses down there for a while and stuff like that. And then he was road foreman of engines out around Manassas. And as I understand it, when he was out on the road there, he had a heart attack. So he more or less had to take early retirement because of that, because he couldn't go out on the trains anymore. And then about that time was when George Roos encountered him, invited him to come up to manage the Cedar Point Railroad, which he did. And he and his wife, they had an apartment there in the old breakers. He was quite a character. He didn't have much, he pretended like he didn't have much use for us young college boys coming out there playing in the railroading. But I think he really, in his heart, I think he really kind of was tickled that we cared enough to do that, because he worked with us and tried to teach us what he could. And he said, "You college boys," he said, "you ought to be out there somewhere in the office pushing a pencil. You don't need to be out here doing this." It was quite an experience working with him.
Within the first few months of his stay at Cedar Point, Jack had ironed out all the railroad's major mechanical problems, resulting in very little downtime. The 1964 season also saw the railroad's fleet expanded to 5 locomotives. One was a 1940 H.K. Porter 040T built for the Acme Brick Company in Arkansas. The new engine underwent the same treatment as the number 22 had, with the removal of its saddle tank and steel cab and building a tender for it. It was decked out with a new paint job, ornate headlamp, wooden cowcatcher, cab, and fake squared-off balloon stack. The locomotive entered service halfway through the season, but after only a week of operating, it was withdrawn from service when it threw a drive rod. In 1967, the engine re-entered service as a number 2 named Jenny K after Foster's wife and granddaughter. The 5th locomotive was unique and the oldest one on the roster. Built in 1878 for the Port Huron and Northwestern Railway by the H.K. Porter Company, this 240 was named after one of the company's organizers, Daniel Brown Harrington. D.B. Harrington spent most of his life hauling logs in Upper Michigan until its retirement in 1933. The locomotive's owner then loaned it to the city of Traverse, where it was on display at Clinch Park for over 3 decades. When Roos bought it in 1964, D.B. Harrington was stored outside the back of the CP&LE's engine house for 4 years before any work was done. Unfortunately, D.B. Harrington's boiler failed this test and it was set aside. In 1965, when Albert's lease to George Roos expired, LaSalle offered him the option to buy the 260 along with an H.K. Porter 040. George gladly accepted. Originally built in 1942 as a 38-inch gauge saddle tank, it ran for 8 years at the Carbon Limestone Company in Hillsville, Pennsylvania. The number 34 stayed in storage until Arthur LaSalle bought it in 1962 and restored and re-gauged it for operation at Cherokee Wonderland after leasing Albert to Roos. Renumbered to 4 and given the name Victoria, it's the youngest and largest locomotive on the CP&LE's roster. 1965 was the railroad's smoothest running season yet. Victoria and Albert were used as the main workhorses, with number 22 and Model L serving as backup engines. Since 1963, ridership nearly quadrupled, seeing more than 814,000 passengers in 1965. The next 3 years brought the most change to the railroad ever seen to this day. To up passenger capacity, Jack Foster had 5 smaller open-air type coaches built in-house at the CP&LE's engine shop, nicknamed the Baby Train. They fabricated these cars from roadway tram trains they used to shuttle people from the park's ferry dock to the resort area. With these extra passenger cars, the 2 cabooses were retired at the end of the 1966 season because of their weight and low capacity. In 1967, both the inbound and outbound parts of the line were rerouted to the opposite side of the engine house to facilitate the building of perimeter road. This new road eliminated motorists from having to cross over the funway near the CP&LE's station and instead ran along the bayshore to a new part of the park called Frontier Town. Frontier Town is a 19th century western-themed settlement near where the CP&LE's Ghost Town is. Guests could deboard at a new station that was built for Frontier Town and ride a log flume called Shoot the Rapids, or visit a general store and food stand.
You'll be amazed at the many new rides and exhibits in Frontier Town. There's fun for everyone, whether you enjoy browsing through quaint old western stores or fast action adventures. Everywhere at Cedar Point, you'll find realism, excitement, graceful charm and beauty, including Ohio's cleanest beach, 1,000-boat marina, and the lakefront hotel breakers. Live entertainment at both the Funway and Frontier Town. At Cedar Point, Sandusky, Ohio, where the whole point is fun.
To accommodate the anticipation of increased ridership, a regular 3-train operation was inaugurated during busy days.
First of all, of course, like I say, it was very different because it was still pretty much of a cedar groves out there. Once we got past the engine house, we were blind as far as what was, we knew we weren't very far from, because it was like a dog bone type of shape. And we knew that on the outbound loop that we weren't very far away from the inbound loop, but you couldn't see them. You could hear them, but you couldn't see them. And so that was kind of fun. But we ran usually on a really slow day, we just run 1 train, but on a really busy day, we'd run 3 trains. And we'd usually have one leaving the Midway station, one leaving the Frontier Town station, and one somewhere in between, and they were paced out so that they, get in, load and unload and get going without colliding with each other. But we blew our whistles a lot just so we'd know where the other trains were at. I remember that.
Until Frontier Lift was added in 1968, the CP&LE Railroad was the only way to reach Frontier Town. Attendance rose sharply that 6 additional coaches of the same basic design as the original 1963 built cars were fabricated by Lakecraft to support ridership. In 1968, they also added a 7th locomotive to the roster, another Vulcan Ironworks 040T. Built in 1923, number 802 spent most of his career at the Lehigh Stone Company in Illinois. Under the guidance of Jack Foster, the engine was fully restored in-house and given the number 5. It stayed nameless until 1974, when it was named in honor of Foster. Jack sadly suffered a stroke that same year, forcing his retirement as a CP&LE superintendent. He later passed away in 1982. In 1970, Cedar Point commenced the centennial by extending the main midway an additional 800 feet, making space for 5 new rides. As a result, the CP&LE's route was shortened, and its midway station was moved further back by the engine house. In 1971, Cedar Point added Frontier Trail, a pedestrian walkway between Frontier Town and the main midway, with a pioneer theme. Guests could stroll at their own leisurely pace through the heavily forested area and see themed 1800-style buildings with reenactors exhibiting pioneer crafts. A segment of the CP&LE's original inbound line remained intact after the 1970 reconfiguration, crossing over the trail. Although no longer in operation, the park constructed a quaint station prop at the point where the track intersects with the trail, known as Cedar Junction. The railroad cosmetically restored Roos's D.B. Harrington and put it on display beside the depot, accompanied by one of the cabooses. These new areas of the park became yet another one of George Roos's successful ventures. Between his time in developing Frontier Town, Roos sold his major stake in the CP&LE Railroad to Art Modell and the Cleveland Browns football team.
Art Modell was a big businessman in the Cleveland area, was one of the main owners for the Cleveland Browns. He has fingers into a lot of different abilities to arrange financing. And you already know him, so yeah, why not approach him and say, hey, would you like to get involved? So what was really weird is if you were on the train payroll for the first couple of years, you were actually getting paychecks from the Cleveland Browns. And there's people out there that still have copies of their pay stub that says Cleveland Browns on it, but they're actually running the railroad at Cedar Point. So that was kind of weird.
But that summer, our paychecks actually came out of the Cleveland Browns office. It's almost like I didn't work for Cedar Point, I worked for the Cleveland Browns because Art Modell, the Browns through Art Modell actually owned the railroad at that time.
While Modell and the Browns held ownership of the railroad concession, George Roos continued in his role as its agent and general manager. This arrangement was short-lived. In 1970, the Cedar Point and Lake Erie Railroad Company was acquired by Cedar Point Incorporation. 7 years later, Roos retired as the park's president, but continued to serve his position as the railroad's agent until 1980. In honor of all his contributions to both the park and railroad, in 1981, CP&LE No. 4 Victoria was renamed George R. Roos died in 1984. He left the railroad in good standing, ensuring its future. But as time marched on and more rides were added, the CP&LE took less precedence. Because of unexplained budget issues, the line and locomotive fleet started to deteriorate. By 1989, only Albert, George R., and Maud L. were in operable condition. To ensure the railroad's continuous operation, it was necessary to completely overhaul one or more locomotives. Since the number 22 and number 5 were already out of service and had the oldest boilers, they were the engines selected to be refurbished by Shop Services in Mount Pleasant, Iowa. Number 22 was shipped off first and completed in July 1990 and returned to Cedar Point shortly after. The Jack Foster left in late 1991, and upon its completion in July 1992, it had been renumbered to 44 and renamed Judy K., after the wife of Cedar Point president and CEO Dick Kinzel. Following the completion of both locomotives, Albert and Maud L. were permanently retired from service. Maud was traded to the Walt Disney Company in 1999 for a larger locomotive of the same wheel configuration. Originally built in 1927 as a standard gauge Davenport 040T, the engine was rebuilt as a narrow gauge 244T in 1977 for Marriott's Great America Park, but was never used. For over 2 decades, the locomotive bounced around the country and even wound up undergoing a rebuild at Shop Services at the same time number 22 was there. Upon its arrival at Cedar Point, it was found that the Davenport was too long to negotiate the curve by the main midway station. So Cedar Fair sent it to Knott's Berry Farm in 2007, where it was supposed to be used during off-peak hours. When Cedar Point got the number 1 back in 2010, it was converted to burn coal instead of oil and cut down into a 240. For the CP&LE's 50th anniversary in 2013, it was named in recognition of George A. Beckling. As for the Jenny K, it was sent to Knott's Berry Farm in 2010 to be rebuilt, but after a falling out between Cedar Fair management, those plans ended. In March 2017, Jenny was auctioned off and acquired by Garner Holt. The engine was cosmetically restored and recommissioned the BC Holt. Today, the Cedar Point and Lake Erie Railroad is in better shape than it's ever been. The Judy K and number 22, named after the CP&LE's second superintendent, Mike Myron Hetrick, serve as the fleet's mainstay locomotives, while the Beckling and George R remain as backups. During weekdays, the park operates 1 train, but on busy weekends, it increases service to 2 trains. 3 train operations were discontinued after 1992, and the baby train set cars were sold off in 1998, along with one of the cabooses. 1 still was retained and can be seen from the train right before you pull into Frontier Town. Since the line's major track relocation in 1970, the route has mostly remained unchanged, except for minor realignments made when new rides were added. In 1999, the original inbound track, crossover, and siding by the main Midway station were removed when Millennium Force was built. The last notable realignment occurred in 2006 when Maverick was added. Although almost all the trees and a good portion of the lagoons have been removed, the Ghost Town skeleton animatronics remain. Now called Boneville, this theming has seen upgrades to its existing scenes with new animatronics, lighting, and effects in recent years. Additionally, entirely new scenes have been introduced over the years, like Billy Bob's Sazal Mill, a fisherman fishing on the dock by the first trestle, and Mr. Possum and his Polecat Pickers Band. If you happen to visit the park and ride the railroad, make sure you also walk Frontier Trail to see Albert, situated on display just before the Millennium Force's tunnel. It's a great opportunity to get up close and personal with the locomotive to take photographs. Each year, the CP&LE Railroad continues to be among the top 10 most frequented attractions at Cedar Point. For many riders, the railroad is the first and only time they've ridden behind an authentic steam locomotive. It's an experience that one will remember for a lifetime. I hope everyone enjoyed this video. To help support the channel, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Railroad Street for more videos just like this. Until next time, I'll catch you on the rails.